Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Business Roundtable Podcast. I am David Carr, your host, a founder of Steward Your Business, and I have a brand new guest this week. Super excited to have Jasmin Hurley on with us. Jasmin has a wealth of knowledge and experience. I'm going to let her share a lot about her background and how she got started in being a lawyer, providing legal counsel. And I thought, having you on, Jasmin, today, there's a lot of things that business owners I found struggle with, and we're going to get into this today, kind of from getting certified to getting capital, getting started. And so I felt like you have such a wealth of experience. We're so glad to have you on the podcast. Welcome to the Business Roundtable.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, David.
Absolutely. Now, Jasmin, you and I met through one of our networking groups, Success Champions Network, and which I really appreciate, the B2B space.
Yes.
And I would love to have you share with our listeners your background, because you and I met previously one-on-one. We've had some we call virtual coffees, if you will, and share your journey as from really. I love your background working going into the military, working for other firms, and now you've created your own firm here at JH Legal, and kind of guide us a little bit about your background and what got you to here where you are today.
Yeah. So long road. But I like to say that, definitely a breadth of experience, and both of us do, we have these key building blocks, but everything that we do, there's something that we learn. So at every stage, there's something we can bring forward to the next stage. So, I don't come from a family of lawyers. I am a first generation attorney. I'm a first generation postgraduate out of my immediate family. The only one to go to college. I graduated from the United States Military Academy, served our country as a military police officer, deployed to Iraq, and, building blocks there for just having some of the stick-to-itiveness and hard-headedness, and saying like, I could do this too, and not realizing just how hard some things can be, right?
Yeah.
And so taking that forward, leaving the military, I worked for an industrial cleaning company here in the Columbus area, and decided at one point, look, I want to do something else. I've always wanted to be an attorney. It was as a child, I said I saw JAG, and that was one of the reasons that really informed me joining the military. It's like, oh yeah, I could do that too. I could be a JAG, and then realizing, it's not actually solving mysteries. It's doing like legal work. It's not as fun. I felt like being a military police officer was much more fun, right? But then moving into law school, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I loved the fact that I was able to help people solve their problems.
Yeah.
When I went to law school, I thought, oh, I'm military police, I'm going to do criminal law. No, absolutely not. No business in criminal law whatsoever. But was looking at intellectual property, trademarks, copyrights, and also looking at helping folks with their business, going into corporate law. So that's where I practiced for the last, 7.5 years. I practiced in larger law firms here in the Central Ohio area, helping folks start their business, helping folks navigate the corporate issues that pop up for folks that are, small, medium, larger businesses. And, a couple of years ago, I said, you know what, I think I want to do this on my own. I want to see if this is something I can do. And also I feel like there's a group of folks that are, I don't feel like they're disenfranchised, but what they're looking for, the support they're looking for is not exactly at the big law price point, right? They don't really have the money to be spending thousands and thousands of dollars, first of all, to fix the problems that pop up, or to be proactive in preventing some of those issues. So that's where JH Legal was born, looking at ways to positively posture small to medium businesses, startups, and nonprofits that are not only in the larger metropolitan areas here in Ohio, but the rural areas as well. I live in a rural area in Ohio, just south of Columbus, and there are people starting businesses here too. So being able to support them and support their journey in a way that is meaningful, but also doesn't break the bank, right? There's only so much runway you have
Yeah.
of
Mhm.
money, and eh, having that unexpected spend for a legal issue can be really, really frustrating and concerning, and could break your business. We have
Absolutely.
seen many businesses, even larger businesses, who they end up having to lay off the majority of their workforce to accommodate a legal issue that has popped up and has pushed into litigation. So, uh,
Mhm.
I try to help folks avoid that as
Yes.
much as possible.
Well, I so appreciate that. I really hear that coming across. You're looking and finding those, you know, underserved founders, those people out there that need help, and particularly, I work with a women-owned small business here in California, and I see, I had a gentleman on a few podcasts ago, Matt. We were talking about he's in the recruiting space, but helping veteran-owned businesses hire the right people, get everything set up. And so I think I really appreciate that's why you're here on the podcast. And I say every week on the Business Roundtable, I said we have folks on the podcast here that can help you be a resource, so you don't have to just go out on your own. And I want them to, people to hear as many different voices where they're at. And I know you're based in Ohio, but depending on what the circumstances is, you can help them in other places as well. So just, we're going to put all your information in the podcast notes here, Jasmin, so people can reach out to you. So very, very important. Can you talk a little bit about just kind of that, like that startup structure and kind of legal readiness that we should be looking at as a founder? Like you said, I'm starting up my business. What are the things, like what are you hearing from folks as they're reaching out to you, or the things that they maybe should be asking when they're like starting that foundation?
Yeah, so there are a couple things that pop out that are pretty consistent. I just happened to meet
Mhm,
with a contact yesterday, and she said, "Yeah, when I set up my business, I used LegalZoom,
mhm,
um, and now I'm paying them a monthly fee for them to be my statutory agent, or they did
mhm,
something wrong."
mhm,
Folks are looking for ways to either DIY, right,
mhm,
or do something affordably. Well, just
mhm.
affordable doesn't mean it's going to be done the right way, right?
Yeah. Yep.
It doesn't mean that it is going to be something that serves you in the long run. You may end up paying them a ton of money over the course of months or years for something that
Mhm,
you can do yourself for free, right? Or you
mhm,
can find a service provider that's local, right?
mhm,
Um, and if something's wrong, they're not going to fix it, right? So
mhm.
folks who are going to LegalZoom, Rocket Lawyer, those sorts of things, I understand the affordability, but that does not mean that it's going to put you in a positive posture for
Mm,
moving
mhm.
forward. Um,
Yeah.
Folks who don't have any documents, right? I'd rather you
Mhm.
have documents as opposed to not having, the appropriate governing documents that you're supposed
Mm,
to have, right? Making sure that
right.
you have your certificate of incorporation, you have your bylaws, you have your operating agreement depending upon your structure, making
Mhm,
sure that you have those in place. If you are if you're a solopreneur, if
mhm,
you're a sole member of an LLC,
mhm,
it's easier to get away with not having that.
mhm,
It becomes more dangerous if you're in a partnership, right? If you have
mm.
more than one person, more than one
Yep,
founder working on things, and all of a sudden what you agreed to yesterday is not where you're sitting a year from now. So
yep.
not having those documents in place and having those agreements, having them signed, is
Mhm,
those are some pitfalls that I'm seeing for folks as well. And that's usually where I'm meeting some of these folks. Um,
mhm,
More often than not, I'm not meeting them with, "Hey, I have an idea. I want to start from scratch." I'm
mhm,
meeting them 6 months, a year down the line, where things have already been done, and
mhm.
we need to fix them. We need to adjust. Founders fell out.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
Now we have to initiate a business divorce in some way, which makes
Mhm.
it much more difficult when you don't
Yep,
have the documents that govern how to act during that business divorce. While I'd love
mhm.
to keep people, when before they get into the business marriage,
Yep,
that's often where I'm meeting some folks and trying to figure out how do we make this how do we make this as painless as possible? How
mhm.
do we adjust and create that positive posture for them?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's really important. I totally hear where you're getting at. I think if people can be a little more proactive in these things instead of going back and trying to fix it and do cleanup, it's more expensive that way too. I'm sure you have to do a little cleanup, right? Instead of if we got it right from the get go.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I see this in working with teams, even not legally, but looking at teams and setting up um, role descriptions and how we're organizing our company, and it's not clear. And so if you just kind of get going, I get it to a degree, you want to get going, but it taking that time to plan, prepare, to go through and not just kind of band-aid it, if you will, but actually do it more proactively. Leading really, it's not just putting a legal structure, but it's how do you lead well and address these things so that you're not opening yourself up. I think one of the things I would be curious about is particularly those folks that, it's one thing if it's fortunate if you can bootstrap this and do it yourself financially. But if you're, like you said, partnerships, or you're looking to get funding, let's just say, like, I want to go to a bank eventually, I want to find, you know, get myself set up. Are you setting yourself up so it's easy for people to want to invest and give you money? Or are you making it really hard for them to, like, I don't know. So, could you talk anything a little about getting funded, or just kind of, or the certification, like getting these things in place so it makes it easier for, and one, people want to work with you
Yeah.
versus, you know, making it sometimes more difficult,
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And different aspects apply to different
Yep.
structures, your business structure. If you're a small business,
Mhm.
you're engaging in more institutional funding as opposed
Mhm.
to startups where, you're working with
Mhm.
investors, venture capital firms, private
Mhm.
equity, where what they're looking for, the standard is a little bit more buttoned up as opposed
Uh-huh.
to, if you're just going to the bank, you want to make sure you have your governing documents, you
Mhm.
have your you have your resolutions approving who can, do the banking and
Mhm.
items like that. Whereas, it may need to be a little bit more buttoned up for startups.
Mhm.
And you mentioned certification, so I want to
Yeah,
talk about.
absolutely. Let's get into it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's talk about certification. So, one of the areas where I sit is working with, you mentioned underserved founders. Those are folks
Mhm.
who are historically, that may not be something that exists in the future, and I would hope that in the future it doesn't exist, right?
Mhm. Yep.
But historically have been underserved in small business, and those
Mhm.
folks who are minorities, those folks who are economically disadvantaged,
Mhm.
women, veterans. And in the state of Ohio, they also look at folks who are coming from the Appalachian region as well as,
Mhm.
economically disadvantaged,
Mhm.
which is something that most folks don't realize, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Where you are, where you sit in the country could also be considered as a historically underserved part of America. So
Yep.
where I particularly sit does not fall in that realm, but we have
Mhm.
counties here in Ohio where our small business owners do qualify as underserved.
Yep.
Uh, and those certifications do open doors for folks, not just for funding, but opportunities as well. Whether
Mhm.
it is contracting opportunities, so being
Yep.
able to bid or engage in the bidding process for contracts that are on the municipal, the state, or the federal level.
Yep.
We're also working and engaging in supplier diversity programs for Fortune 500 companies.
Mhm.
And here in the state of Ohio, they have funding set asides for women owned and minority owned businesses, those
Mhm.
businesses that are certified with the state. And a lot of states also have similar programs.
Yes.
Um, there are certification platforms like WeBank, NMSDC, where they not only provide those funding opportunity, or not the funding, the contracting opportunities, but they
Mhm.
also provide additional support for those certified businesses in the
Yeah.
form of training, in the form of showcasing their goods and their services, and
Mhm.
matchmaking opportunities to be able to connect them with those actual businesses that are looking for those diverse suppliers. So, as myself, as a woman-owned business, a veteran-owned business, and a minority-owned business,
Yeah.
I fell into this type of work. It wasn't something where I engaged in it directly. it just happened to kind of sit in my lap as I was working with, in my first law firm, we had a case come through. And so engaging with that and then realizing, oh, I'm already in a veteran space, a veteran owner, a business owner space. I'm already as a veteran, as a woman, as a minority, I'm already navigating these spaces where there are other business owners that are trying to navigate as well. So it has been helpful to me already knowing how to navigate that space.
Yes, right.
I'm a new business owner myself. So now I know how to better navigate as well, in the certifications. And I will say I'm remiss in obtaining my certifications. That's something where it's on my list of to-dos for my business, because it does open doors. Folks want to do business, with these underserved businesses. So make it easier. And that's what I tell folks. A lot of folks are reluctant to obtain certifications because they feel like they don't deserve it or they are not worthy of it. There are folks that want to do business with you. Why would you make it harder to find you and do business with you?
It's kind of like, you're handicapping yourself. If this is the playing field that we're on, so to speak, it would be like, I agree with you. I was going to ask that question. Why do you think, certification is underutilized at times? They skip it because you just said like maybe they feel they don't deserve it or, but I think, it is there. It's like you said, maybe it won't be there forever, but for now it is. And we're trying to, so I think, use that and help. Again, ultimately it's helping you, like I said, build a relationship. But I think having worked with a woman-owned small business, minority-owned business as well, previous company, in fact, I just had her on my podcast recently, but I stepped in her company, like what you said, Jasmin, earlier, like as it helped me as an employee be a part and do more than I would have had otherwise. So it wasn't just the business owner themselves. It's like, who else are you having being a part of your organization that you get to help? But I think that's a little bit about it, at least for me. And I'm very thankful for that. But I do think it is depending on that you mentioned, there's different groups that, look at these things. And here, I'm here in California. So we have definitely certain set asides on a federal level, and also on the state level in different agencies. Like we have our Caltrans, which is our transportation agency, and other ones. I've worked with this one, so they can be a little daunting sometimes to go through this certification process,
Yeah. So as we're talking about where I usually step into these situations, there are two kind of entry points for where I'm engaged. More often than not, I'm engaged after they've, these business owners have received a rejection, right? They've received a rejection and they said, what, but I'm a woman-owned business. I'm a minority-owned business. And they're not realizing that there are two prongs to it. The ownership, which a lot of folks tend to get pretty easy, right? Say it's a woman-owned business, husband and wife owns 51%, husband owns 49%. She's the head of the business, right? Second prong to it is the control. And that's usually where I step in. I help folks tell their story because they either didn't tell their story correctly. They didn't point out, while the husband and wife both work in the business, the wife definitely has the authority. She has the control. She's the one who's all the decisions. And, is ultimately doing what they're doing. And also she has experience. She may not have experience doing this specific thing, but she has experience in XYZ, which also roll into the business. As a business owner, you're wearing all of the hats, right? I'm not just an attorney. I'm also, accounts receivable, accounts payable, the marketing person, the social media manager,
all of that,
all of the HR, all of it, right? So, taking that and telling that story about how all of that is what goes into what they're doing. So working with folks who have received a rejection and understanding how to navigate that and, working through how do they address that? Can it be addressed? and what the timing is, because there are some, dependent upon the certified authority, there are ways to navigate that.
Mm-hmm.
And then folks who just say, hey, I'm a woman-owned business, I want to seek certification.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Mm-hmm.
open, right?
Right.
So counseling folks on not just what certifications, but understanding what their true purpose for the certification is.
Yes.
And being able to help them create a strategy for that certification and obtaining those certifications. There are certain certifications where they're free, usually state and municipal level certifications, particularly here in Ohio. They tend to be free certifications. You don't need to pay a fee. If you're working with a nonprofit certifying authority like WeBank or NMSDC or an Novoba, there is a fee based off of the amount of your amount of revenue that you're bringing in. So understanding where your objectives lie. The federal is also free. I want to make sure that's put out, free certification.
Right.
Understanding what your objectives are, and then layering those certifications appropriately. Part of that is also doing an audit, right? Just doing an audit of your business and the way that you are set up, the way that you're formed, the way that you're incorporated, and making sure that we are pinpointing any potential issues. Again, it goes back to the ownership and the control, right? Very often people say, oh, 51% owned and controlled, but they only see the 51% owned. They don't realize the control, and that's where
so important. Yeah.
That's where you have some issues. So setting them up for success based off of what their objectives are. And it's become a little bit more difficult, I'd say, over the last couple of years, because there have been some pretty, I wouldn't say significant, but there have been some changes to the definition of control. Some good, some making it a little bit more difficult for folks in the way that they run their business. So I always tell folks, before you even start firing off those certifications, let's have a conversation to figure out what your structure looks like. It's much more difficult once you've received a rejection, because there usually are time limits that you have to wait. And then going through and restructuring your business so that it makes you competitive, makes it that much more expensive, as opposed to on the back end. We can truly reflect what your intent for your business is, and then tell the story from there. And it's a lot easier for me to sniff out those folks that are, and it doesn't happen as often, right? Some folks are like, oh, well, they're just structuring this so they can meet the criteria and get over. I think I've only seen that once. And in counseling that particular person, this was many years ago. And in counseling that person, I said, look, if that's your intent, and if your wife is really going to truly be involved in this business, give up more control. Otherwise, this is going to continue to fail. And the spirit of it is not being met in what you're doing.
Absolutely.
So nice try. I don't like to think that I'm gatekeeping, but I'm going to provide some honest counsel.
Absolutely.
In these situations, because you better believe that when you get to that certifying authority, they are not idiots. They have seen something under the sun and suss out pretty quickly when something is not meeting.
I wanted to bring up what you mentioned, because I think the ownership, like you said, is fairly easy. I get that one gets pretty, but the control one I think is important, because I'll give you this scenario, or just an example for listeners here. I'm based here in California. One of our utility providers, Southern California Edison, they're a big one. They're big on diversity of suppliers and making sure we have all that. And they had one in there, and they did an audit of all of them. They actually audited them to see what the control was, and ultimately, there wasn't the control that they said it was. And the company was stripped of their woman-owned status. And that caused a ripple effect of employees and other people that had to then now find other work, because that work that was coming through was contingent upon it being controlled by a woman-owned business. And it was like, it wasn't like they gave you a grace period. It was like, that's it today. Boom. You don't get like a week, 2 weeks, a month of, it's like, we're turning off the faucet.
Yeah, because you've not met the criteria. And it really depends on, those particular set asides. Why would you put those set asides and any other type of your supplier diversity in jeopardy by allowing this to happen? Essentially, it's fraud, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You say something exists and it does not, right?
Yep.
And so I would say for folks, that are looking for certification, are thinking about, diverse business certification, engaging in participating in diverse supplier programs, take a hard look at your documents, make sure you understand control, understand what certification program you're looking to engage in, and understanding what they define as control, because it does vary, and it has changed. There are a couple federal level programs where what's considered control has a little bit more leeway given to reflect actual situations, particularly for women-owned businesses, and for veteran-owned business, specifically service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, SDVOSPs. State level programs have changed here in the state of Ohio. They had a change about structure, what they certified for structure. A couple years ago, the city of Columbus changed, the control, some of their control provisions as well. So making sure you understand that, make sure that your governance, your actual governance documents, your operating agreement, your certificate of incorporation, follow and meet that criteria. Happy with that. If you have any questions or concerns, right? And then you stick to that, right? You do not want the egg on your face by stating that you are a certified women-owned business, certified minority-owned, veteran-owned, service-disabled, veteran-owned small business, and then realizing that there's creep. And that's really what happens, right? It's a creep in your process and procedure. So, process and procedure is big. In business, if you don't have it, you don't have those systems, things can fall apart pretty quickly. So making sure that you understand that you have systems in place to audit yourself.
Yeah.
Sure that you can, you're following and doing what you said that you are doing, and that, you're not going outside of those control parameters.
Yeah. Well, you brought up a couple of things that came to mind as you're talking about this. It's the control, and then I know you also look at contracts, and so it's one thing to get on the certified side, and then look at what are the terms of the contract that you're pursuing, and are you fulfilling that too? Because oftentimes it is, are you doing, as a set aside, particularly for a business, are you doing the majority of the work, or are you outsourcing that perhaps to independent contractors? Do they have the same? It may work if they have the same certification, right? If they're also, a set, it can roll up and say, hey, we're still meeting the overall threshold. But if they're doing the majority of that work and they aren't that diversity as a supplier, and that the goal was to you as a company, not just be a pass-through to another company, looking at that, right? Looking at the contract, what are the terms of the contract? What's the intent of the contract? And are you in alignment with that? Or could they call you out and say, no, this isn't actually what we envisioned?
Right. Yeah. And it again, like you said, it flows through. So you need to make sure, you're meeting the intent, of the program, as well as the letter. And I mean, let's be honest, once it's in a contract, once it's in, the terms of your contract, going outside of that makes it a much more difficult for you to argue. Right.
Right. Oh man, there's so many good things here we're covering, Jasmin. I know, and I want to. There's a couple before we wrap up the podcast. I just want to get through a few more questions, because I mean we're gonna have to come back. But what, as we're talking about, getting through the certification process and kind of prepping, just having legal confidence. What are some things that other things that maybe we should be thinking about, to help build just our confidence, not just compliance, but making sure that we're feeling like we're prepared, What are you seeing, like maybe red flags that they aren't prepared for growth? Maybe it's dealing with like a early agreement or non-disclosure agreement, or what are the things that you're seeing like to build that confidence? Like, hey, I've got some things in place. I'm getting there. What
Yeah.
what do you see there?
Yeah, well, I would say a couple of things. First, not having your governance documents in place, right? I
Mhm,
keep harping on that, but it is a building block, right? It is a cornerstone for your
mhm,
business, making sure that you have your governance documents in place. Whatever your structure is, having that your those bylaws, that operating agreement, making sure that you have those governance documents and any additional documents that governs the relationship you have
mhm,
with yourself, the other owners in your business, right?
mhm,
So if
mhm,
there are other founders and you decided on some things and it's not reflected in your bylaws or your certificate of incorporation, you need to make sure you have either shareholders agreement, a founders agreement, something that says, hey, here's how we agreed that we are going to operate in this particular relationship, right?
mhm.
A lot of the conversations that I have with startups are we had a founder and then turns out they wanted to bounce because we're founders and we're not getting paid and they want to get paid.
Yep.
Hey, it's a lot more difficult to have that divorce, right?
Mhm,
Um, some other things that I see, not really understanding the initial agreements that they are signing with vendors,
mhm,
with suppliers, with service providers. Understand the key elements of those, the key terms of those agreements. Understand what you're supposed to do when it goes wrong, right?
mhm.
Understand termination. If somebody is not doing what they're supposed to do in
Yeah.
your relationship and your agreement, make
Mhm.
sure that you understand what your obligations are to either
Absolutely.
give them notice about the issues that you're seeing, how you're supposed to give them notice, and then what do you get to do if you feel like they've
Mhm,
breached the contract, they promised something and they didn't provide it, then how do you terminate that contract? That does not
mhm,
mean that you say, I'm out and bounce, right?
mhm,
Be an early
mhm,
termination fee if you do not provide them with a certain day's note or a certain day's notice. There could be an ability for that particular service provider or vendor to cure the issue. So you have to give them a chance to fix what was
mhm.
wrong before
Yeah.
you complete the agreement, right?
Yes.
So just had an issue with a client where they went through that and they were on the
Mhm.
hook for an early termination fee because they decided that they were just going to terminate, right?
Yep.
If you have a problem with a vendor, if you have a problem with the service provider, you let them know that you have this problem and you try to either figure it out, work through it, or you understand what your obligations are, for that termination.
Mhm.
I would say the third thing, and this is, next to working with underserved founders, it's near and dear passion of mine is intellectual property. Not understanding the types of intellectual property that a business has. Every business has intellectual property from the get go, right? Your
Mhm.
name, the
Yep.
marketing that you're putting out there, whether you are engaging in using, you know, different types of marketing software, different types of social media, the thought leadership that you are creating
Yep.
about your industry, working with things like Canva,
Mhm.
that's one where folks are like, yeah, I don't have any marketing. I was like, you just slapped a really awesome pamphlet together that you sent
Mhm.
me. And you put a lot of effort into thinking about that. I highly doubt you just pulled that off of Canva and then slapped it
Mhm.
over to me, it willy
Mhm.
nilly.
Yep.
With the advent of generative AI, it's making
Mhm.
it a lot easier for folks to be able to create
Mhm.
intellectual property and create these types of things. So understanding one, what you're creating, two, how to protect it, and three, when it's not protected, when it is something where you may be operating under a license for that. Um,
Mhm.
I always tell folks, please don't try to register clip art. Like, don't. There
Yep.
are some sources out there where they are open source, right?
Yep.
You can use those to create protectable items for your business, but going on a Microsoft Word and clip art and things like that, and then try to submit that as your logo, like, please, oh gosh, no. Or there are folks who they engage with Upwork, Fiverr, those types of platforms, to have somebody create that for them, making sure that person, right, is first and foremost signing their rights that they've created that to you, so that you can then take it and use it and protect it in the way that you need to be able to for your business, and that they're not using clip art, and everything that's under a third-party license that would prevent you later on down the road from taking that intellectual property and being able to protect it in the way that you need to.
Wow, you've hit a lot of great topics here, and I know we could go deeper. But big takeaway I'm hearing, and I would love you to share as we're wrapping up the podcast here, Jasmin, your kind of final takeaways and thoughts. But what I'm hearing is, it's really important how I'm showing up as the business owner, being real about where I'm at, and looking outside of myself, getting help, not being siloed, if you will, and in really incorporating this legal review, just as I would other professional services, to help me and create a growth engine in my business, so that I'm not being shut down, but I'm actually, being able to multiply and have the effect that, and so I just appreciate you coming on and sharing with our listeners some of these thoughts, some of these things they should be thinking about in their journey. And we're not here if you're year, 2 years, 3 or 5 years in, whatever, and you're like, man, I have neglected this area, and it hasn't maybe bit me yet, but it could tomorrow, the next day. Maybe take a moment, like you said, pause, and here's Jasmin as another resource that you can reach out to and connect to. And again, we're gonna have all your information in the show notes, Jasmin. But just kind of final thoughts, sharing with our audience just key takeaways that you really want them to leave listening to this episode of the Business Roundtable.
Yeah, make sure you've got your governance documents in place, right? Review them, whether it's annually, semi-annually. Review them. Make sure that you are still operating in that way. And look at your intellectual property, right? Like I said, I'm a big fan of intellectual property. Look at the way that you are engaging with your intellectual property, and think about your strategy on how to protect that, whether it's under NDAs, under notices. And if you have any questions about either of those things that I talked about, right, I'm here to answer questions. And if I don't know the answer, I'm a big proponent. Let's find you the person that has that answer, because you deserve that as a business owner. You don't have to wait for a legal issue to get your answer.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jasmin, for joining us on the Business Roundtable podcast. Thank you all for listening and subscribing. Leave us your comments. We'll make sure that Jasmin gets them. We'll, of course, love your reviews, subscribing and sharing this with others. Again, Jasmin, wonderful to have you on the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, David.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Until next time, take care. Be well. Appreciate you being here with us on the Business Roundtable podcast.